The Gulf of Mexico has gone almost completely silent this hurricane season, a silence stretching on now for weeks, with barely a ripple showing up on satellite imagery. No swirling satellite images to worry about, no frantic evacuation warnings interrupting anyone's evening, no named storms churning toward the coast, at least not yet. For most people, that silence sounds like good news, a welcome break after years of anxious storm watching along the coast. But talk to the meteorologists actually tracking this pattern, and you will hear something very different. They are not relieved. They are watching the calendar tick closer to the most dangerous stretch of the year, and the quiet itself is exactly what has them nervous right now. Before we break down exactly why an empty radar screen is making experts uneasy rather than relieved, if the hidden mechanics behind hurricane forecasting genuinely interest you, hit like on this video right now, because what looks like a lucky, quiet summer might actually be setting the stage for something meteorologists have seen play out before, and it rarely ends the way people expect. Let's start with just how quiet this season has actually been, because the numbers are genuinely striking once you actually sit down and look closely at them. As of the 20th of August, the Atlantic Basin had produced only 3 named storms all summer: Arthur, Bertha, and Cristobal, each one weak, short-lived, and largely forgettable compared to a typical season. Arthur formed in the Gulf of Mexico back in June, and despite its disorganized, weak appearance, still managed to dump more than 700 millimeters of rain across parts of Louisiana. Bertha followed roughly a month later, a lopsided system that brought some wind and rain to the northern Gulf Coast before fading. Cristobal barely counted as a storm at all, surviving for exactly 1 day in a remote corner of the northern Atlantic before dissipating entirely. On the surface, that might sound almost normal, the kind of statistic that would barely register as a headline on its own. A typical Atlantic season produces around 4 named storms by the middle of August, so 3 does not sound catastrophically behind schedule. But forecasters do not judge a hurricane season purely by counting storms. They use a measurement called accumulated cyclone energy, or AC, which captures both the intensity and the duration of every storm in the basin. A monstrous, long-lived hurricane like Katrina generates an enormous ACE value. A weak, short-lived tropical storm barely registers at all, and when meteorologists ran the numbers for this season through the 20th of August, the result was stark, laid bare in a graph that immediately caught the attention of hurricane specialists across the country. A typical Atlantic season produces an ACE value of roughly 18.0 by that date. This year, the actual total sat at just 3.0. Only 17% of what would normally be expected at this exact point in the calendar. If understanding how meteorologists actually measure a hurricane season's true intensity, rather than just counting storm names, fascinates you the way it fascinates us, go ahead and subscribe. Because we dig into exactly this kind of behind-the-scenes climate science every single week. So why has the Atlantic gone this quiet? Meteorologists point to several overlapping factors working together, not just one single cause. The most significant driver is this year's powerful, rapidly strengthening El Niño building in the Pacific Ocean, a pattern that reliably increases wind shear across the tropical Atlantic and Caribbean, wringing developing systems apart almost as soon as they begin to form. That wind shear acts almost like an invisible hand reaching down and tearing developing storms apart before they ever have the chance to organize into anything dangerous. But El Niño is only part of the story. Fewer thunderstorm clusters than usual have been rolling off the African coast this year, the very seeds that typically grow into the Atlantic's strongest hurricanes. Repeated bursts of dry, dusty air blowing off the Sahara Desert have further starved the atmosphere of the moisture tropical systems need to develop. Another layer of the same broader pattern working against storm formation this year. And perhaps, most surprisingly, even though sea surface temperatures across most of the Atlantic have been sitting close to normal, there has been a notable lack of deep, sustained warm water specifically across the Gulf of Mexico, the kind of thick, heat-saturated layer that powerful hurricanes rely on to maintain their strength rather than quickly churning up cooler water underneath and losing steam. That specific detail, warm surface water without the deep reservoir of heat beneath it, is exactly the kind of thing meteorologists watch closely, because it means any storm that does form has less fuel available to intensify rapidly and sustain that intensity over time, at least for as long as this particular ocean structure remains in place. If the idea that forecasters can diagnose an entire ocean basin's hurricane potential by studying subtle details like water depth and Saharan dust plumes genuinely fascinates you, go ahead and subscribe. Because we break down exactly this kind of hidden climate science every single week. Local officials and climatologists along the coast have been walking a careful line in how they communicate all of this to the public. One Louisiana climatologist, discussing the season's unusually calm start, pointed to Colorado State University's projections of just 9 named storms this year, well below the historical average of 14, and described that outlook as genuinely encouraging news for a state that has historically taken some of its worst hits during busy August storm seasons. At the same time, he was careful to remind residents that staying weather aware needs to remain a habit regardless of how the seasonal averages look on paper, because averages describe an entire basin over an entire season, not any single family's risk on any single night. That tension between legitimate relief over a genuinely favorable set of numbers and the very real possibility that any given year could still produce one devastating outlier is exactly what keeps meteorologists from ever declaring a season safe until the calendar reaches December. So here is the real question. If the ingredients for hurricanes are genuinely missing this year, why are meteorologists still nervous? The answer comes down to history, and it is a history that experts keep repeating with real urgency. No Atlantic hurricane season in the modern era, going back through every single year of reliable record keeping, has ever finished without at least one storm reaching full hurricane strength. Not one. That statistic alone should give anyone pause before assuming this year will somehow be the historic exception. And some of the quietest seasons on record carry warnings baked directly into their own history. Warnings meteorologists say deserve just as much attention as any single-named storm actively churning across the ocean right now. The quietest Atlantic season in living. Memory occurred in 1983, producing just 4 named storms all year. One of those 4 storms was Hurricane Alicia, which slammed into Texas with winds of 115 miles per hour and caused billions of dollars in damage, proving conclusively that a quiet season and a harmless season are never the same thing. Even more striking, the destructive Hurricane Andrew, one of the most devastating storms ever to strike the United States, and a name Florida residents still use as the benchmark against which every other hurricane gets measured, did not even form until the very end of August during its own historically slow season, catching an entire region off guard after weeks of calm. The lesson from both of those years is identical. A slow start says almost nothing about how the second half of the season will actually unfold, a conclusion backed by more than a century of consistent Atlantic hurricane records. There is also an intriguing contrast playing out in a completely different ocean basin that helps illustrate just how unusual this Atlantic pattern really is. While the tropical Atlantic has stayed remarkably subdued, the Pacific Ocean has been anything but quiet this year, producing a steady parade of storms between Hawaii and Mexico, including one system powerful enough to briefly threaten the Hawaiian Islands directly. That side-by-side contrast, one ocean basin roaring with activity while the neighboring Atlantic sits almost completely still, is itself a signature of a strong El Niño year, since the very same shift in Pacific Ocean temperature responsible for suppressing Atlantic storms tends to supercharge tropical activity across the central and eastern Pacific at the exact same time. It is a reminder that this year's quiet Gulf is not simply the absence of storms globally, it is a redirection of the atmosphere's energy toward an entirely different part of the planet. There is also a structural reason why late August specifically deserves this level of caution. Hurricane season officially peaks around the 10th of September, and the window between the final full week of August and the middle of October produces the overwhelming majority of the season's most powerful, most dangerous storms every single year, almost without exception. Forecasters have already been tracking early signs of potential trouble brewing west of Africa as August draws to a close. Exactly the kind of tropical wave that, under slightly more favorable conditions, has historically spun up into the season's first serious hurricane. Threat. The very system meteorologists say deserves close attention over the coming days. That timing matters enormously for another reason, too. Even a genuinely below-average season in terms of total storm count only needs one single system to find the right combination of warm water and weakening wind shear at exactly the wrong moment to become a historic disaster for whichever community happens to be standing in its path. Meteorologists studying past El Niño hurricane seasons are quick to point out that the atmospheric breaks suppressing storm formation this summer, the wind shear, the dry air, the lack of deep ocean heat, do not need to disappear completely to allow a dangerous storm to form. They only need to relax briefly in one specific location for a matter of days, and history shows that window tends to open at least once every single season without fail. So what should people living along the Gulf Coast actually take away from all of this? That message meteorologists keep repeating is not one of alarm, but of caution against complacency, a distinction they say matters enormously for how coastal residents actually prepare over the coming weeks. A quiet August has never once been a reliable predictor of a quiet September or October, and the specific atmospheric ingredients suppressing this year's activity, while currently strong, are not permanent fixtures locked into place for the rest of the season. Wind shear patterns shift. Saharan dust plumes thin out and disperse, sometimes within just a few days of a favorable pattern change taking hold. And as ocean temperatures continue climbing toward their annual peak in the weeks ahead. Even a modest reduction in the atmosphere's current hostility toward tropical development could be enough to finally let a serious storm organize. That is really the story underneath this summer's unusually empty radar screens. It was never really about whether the Gulf would stay quiet forever, even though it has genuinely felt that way to residents scrolling through weeks of storm-free forecasts. It is about the fact that hurricane season's most dangerous chapter is only just beginning, and a slow start has historically been far more likely to precede a sudden dramatic turn than to guarantee smooth sailing all the way to November. If this closer look at why an eerily quiet ocean can actually be a warning sign rather than good news changed the way you think about hurricane season, do not scroll away without hitting subscribe. Because we break down stories exactly like this one every single week, tracking the science behind the calm as closely as we track the storms themselves. And if you found this breakdown valuable, tap that like button right now, because it genuinely helps this kind of research-driven content reach more people who want to understand what is actually happening in the atmosphere in real time, well before any single storm ever makes headlines of its own. The Gulf may be quiet right now, but the meteorologists watching it closely know exactly how quickly that silence can end, sometimes within a matter of days, once the right conditions finally align.